Hey now, RotoGrinders, welcome to Stonk Watch, where we will examine the best ball marketplace weekly for ADP and in the context of investing. We're going to be trying to find some players and strategies that can help us maximize our returns in 2024 best ball. Joining me to do that is Kyle Murray. Kyle, welcome to the show. Welcome to week number 2 of Stonk Watch. Are you ready to talk some ball?
Yeah, I am. Last week I feel like went pretty well, and I'm excited to continue to talk about some of these market movements and talk a little bit more about our draft strategies. I'm looking forward to it.
My name is Chris Gimino, and of course, we are the leaders of the projections team here at RotoGrinders for fantasy football, and we are going to be starting off our conversation this week in the ADP marketplace, looking at some actual stacks that have started to climb in ADP. Now, Kyle, I think there's been some steam around the industry around taking more than 2 quarterbacks in your build, and I think that's somewhat related. Just some content hit the streets. I know Established Run did some stuff, and I'm sure that's getting echoed across the industry in terms of the different types of, roster construction strategies you can take. For example, a lot of players like to take 2 quarterbacks only when they get an elite quarterback, but if you tend to wait on your quarterback, taking 3 has been more of a strategy that some research that ETR did showed gets you to the top. But I'm not here to say that's exactly the reason that these stacks have started to rise. Just something that I've noticed has been happening in the last couple of days here. So let's start by talking about the Titans stack. Now, these are all going to be cheap stacks that we're looking at here, Kyle. So these aren't necessarily the top stacks on the board, so to speak, but the Titan stack with Levis, Ridley, Hopkins, and Chigokonkwo, all those guys have been moving up here. Do you got any sense of whether or not you're going to be buying or selling these guys as they start to rise in ADP?
Yeah, I think from a sense from some of these stacks that we're going to talk about, they are all pretty cheap. So I would keep that in mind in terms of, going overboard in terms of buying or selling, just because it's not like it costs a whole lot to buy them. I think these Titans receivers are going to be the most expensive guys that we're really going to talk about. But I have found myself drafting Hopkins and Ridley in this sort of mid-range where it seems like it's a little bit more of a soft spot. So I have no problem adding Levis and Chig later on in drafts just to kind of complete that stack. I would expect this team obviously to throw a little bit more with no Derrick Henry and having 2 running backs who do pretty well in the passing game. Ridley did show a little bit of being dust last year, but he also flashed a little bit of skill. So I think it could be a mixed bag what we see this year, but the Titans were willing to pay him a ton of money once again. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him, sort of come in and have that 1A role here. Maybe he has a little bit more gas left in the tank. And I do think we could potentially see some spike weeks for these guys, especially in a division where we could potentially see some big games and matchups with Jacksonville and Houston as well. So I do not mind, targeting this stack here, especially from a correlation standpoint.
Yeah, Brian Callahan comes from Cincinnati. They were one of the highest pass rate over expectation teams in 2023. We would expect them to bring at least some of that philosophy over to the Titans. The Titans only have a short win total. I think it's 5.5. So you would expect that they might be trailing in some games and maybe having to rely on the pass late in contests. And of course, the price is pretty depressed. I'm buying this stack for now. If it gets too much higher, we'll have to start having conversation. But I mean, you can pretty easily get Ridley and Hopkins in the middle rounds where people are drafting a lot of wide receivers these days. And then Chig, of course, if you whiff on whatever stack you were trying for late, you can always fall back onto a Levis Chig combo, or also Tyjae Spears, quite frankly, is another player that I like to put into that stack. Looking at Jacksonville as your Week 17 opponent, and those guys are not too expensive either. You have Kirk's going to be the most expensive guy, but you can get Evan Ingram and either Thomas or Davis down the board there as well when you're starting to take those Titans guys. So overall, that's actually a pretty attractive game to stack if you ask me, and that could be a fun one come Week 17. Let's move on to our second stack, the New England Patriots stack. This is by far less attractive on paper in terms of how we feel about the New England Patriots in 2024. Certainly the expectations are low. However, the price tag is low right along with it. Drake May being drafted at 195. Although, again, this is an ADP marketplace show. He's up actually 4 spots, probably because of some of this late round quarterback steam / 3 quarterback steam that we are seeing. And of course, Ramondre Stevenson just signed that big contract. I believe that contract was 4 years, $36 million for Stevenson. He's also someone that people are drafting a little bit more confidently because of that. Demario Douglas, though, let's talk about that. I may have mentioned him last week, but he's up 10 spots to 167. I mean, I think that was just a misprice, if you ask me, and that this isn't some revelation that people are having that all of a sudden he's some great asset. I just do think that the early price tag on him was quite a bit low. People were overdrafting the rookies. Hunter Henry up 2 spots. What are we doing with New England? I know last week in the quarterback episode, we talked that we do have some affinity for Drake May just because of the rushing ability, but Kyle, he might not start for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there is, a little bit of an argument to, rookies being a little bit more formidable in best ball formats where, where the money is sort of made later on in the season. These rookies are expected to be more productive and develop more throughout the year. So that does bode well for the case of Drake May. And again, he's very, very cheap in drafts. And for, us, we have both talked about liking Stevenson and Douglas. So it's fairly easy to just go ahead and complete a Patriot stack here by adding May, and then even guys like Hunter Henry, you can throw Jalen Polk into that conversation as well for guys that you can stack for this Patriots team. So with Stevenson and Douglas being so easy to draft, due to how cheap they are and the roles that we're expecting them to have, it does make it fairly easy to just complete the Patriots stack. You can also consider the fact that they are playing teams that we do have interest in, and with the Chargers in week 16 and the Buffalo Bills in week 17, Buffalo is going to be a team that I'm trying to stack often. Chargers are a team that I'm looking to at least get some exposure to, whether it be in that volatile backfield or with some of these pass catchers who are sort of up in arms right now. So I think that's another sort of option for correlation there late on in the playoff season for best ball here. So, and then I think the last argument that I would make is the Patriots have actually gone out and spent a little bit more than in years past on some of their skill position players. Obviously, like you mentioned, they paid Ramondre Stevenson. They've drafted some guys fairly high in the draft in terms of pass catchers. I think there's a good chance that maybe we just saw some of these guys' skill and talent levels completely clouded due to the fact that they had tremendously bad quarterback play the past couple of years. So if Drake May is able to elevate that offense and the skill players around him, I think there's a chance that this team could actually have some skill that we haven't yet seen.
Something I didn't expect to say a couple months ago was that Demario Douglas will be one of my highest drafted players. So far, he is. I don't know if that'll stick. I'm through about 26 drafts on Best Ball Mania right now, and I just God, I hope doesn't hold the whole season. But I mean, I do definitely have plenty of Demario Douglas right now. This is one of the cheapest overall game stacks that you're going to find, right? Because the Bills in Week 16 aren't very expensive as far as getting Keon Coleman, who we'll talk about later, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir. And then, of course, all the Chargers, aside from Ladd, who's continuing to go up in the 6th, 7th round area. Josh Palmer's pretty cheap. Quentin Johnson, nobody knows what the hell he's going to be. So that's a situation where you're not paying a lot to take a gamble on him. So overall, I do think that the Patriot stack is a cheap stack. It is certainly one that has upside, but is also one that could also fall flat if they have the kind of season that the experts / marketplace is predicting. Let's get into the Giants stack. This is also a very difficult stack to pull the trigger on just because, quite frankly, the team doesn't look to be very good. But you got, as a result, Daniel Jones. He's only going at 198-ish right now, but he's up 4 spots, so people are starting to get a little more comfortable with that. People are definitely getting more comfortable with Wan'Dale Robinson, who we mentioned last week, 166, up a couple of spots again. Darius Slayton and Jalen Hyatt, no one knows what to do there. They're getting drafted the very late rounds, but again, they're ticking up very so slightly, which is difficult to do when you're not getting drafted in every single draft. And then, of course, Devin Singletary would be the passing game back piece, allegedly. We don't really exactly know how that's going to play out here in training camp, but Singletary right now looks like the guy. He's flat, 110. What are you doing with the Giants? Do you like this team? Are you buying? Are you taking this stonk to the moon?
I guess I would label this as buy-ish, just because I do like some of these players on their own. I think some of these guys can, definitely find their way onto my teams at the later portions of the draft. But for me, it would be smaller stacks because I feel like a lot of the value that Daniel Jones brings is through his rushing upside. I don't think he's necessarily a quarterback that I'm dying to stack. If I end up drafting him later on in drafts, I think that's fine. But I'm probably not going to be getting to a whole lot of Malik Neighbors, so that really sort of kind of hurts where I'm looking at the ability of actually stacking this team up. I think a Wan'Dale Robinson with Daniel Jones mini stack is totally fine. And then if you want to, you can throw in Jalen Hyatt, and I'll actually add one more name as well, Theo Johnson, who I think has a chance to be the tight end one for this team. So I think both of those guys as later portion stacks, along with Wan'Dale, do pair up fairly nicely with Daniel Jones. But again, I think the upside with Daniel Jones is with his rushing. So I will label that one as buy-ish.
Really, in the early portion of the drafting season here in June and July is really where, like, if you're gonna take a shot on Theo Johnson, maybe you can do it now before we figure it, before we find out that Bellinger's the guy, right? But of course, if we find out Theo Johnson's the guy in training camp, then you're getting yourself a really big discount. That ADP will for sure skyrocket if he gets labeled as someone who's going to be a more prominent part of the offense. But we just don't know right now. So there's some uncertainty. You're basically getting a discount on that uncertainty at his ADP, which is almost undrafted at the moment. You're stacking this team with Indianapolis. Anyone you like on Indianapolis coming back?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that you can make a case for a lot of these guys. Obviously, if you're able to get Jonathan Taylor, I've seen Jonathan Taylor falling in some drafts recently, which is also pretty interesting there. No problem at all taking correlation plays there with Pittman and even Josh Downs, and then even with some of these tight ends, Jelani Woods, I think is a guy you're getting at a very cheap price tag as well. So that'd be a very mini correlation there, but obviously Jonathan Taylor would be my preferred pairing option there. And then even if you happen to have an Anthony Richardson team, I think that there's plenty of ways that you can go about correlating those teams.
All right, let's move on and talk about the fourth stack. Now, this one's not moving up quite as hard as some of the other ones. It's the Carolina Panthers stack. You've got Bryce Young up to 191 in ADP, Deontay Johnson moving up closer to 73. Chuba going up to 166. That's probably the biggest mover here as far as the Carolina Panthers are concerned. Thielen just barely up, and people are still taking Xavier Legette pretty high, 138. No one's taking the tight ends. What are we doing with Carolina? I'm pretty neutral on this, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to really sell at this price just because they are so cheap. But for me, I guess that's where I would label it, just because I'm really not all that enamored with the Panthers offense. I think the arguments of Dave Canales and some revamped weapons there are good potential arguments for a Bryce Young turnaround, but I'm just not overly sold on it. I just don't know if there's a ton of upside here. I think they're going to be a team that wants to run the ball a lot as well. So I think it's just a spot where I'm probably mostly selling, or I guess you could even label it neutral, just because it's such a difficult stack to sell with how cheap they are.
Yeah, Canales was a part of Geno Smith bouncing back in Seattle, a big part of Baker Mayfield last year. So the logic is, okay, Bryce Young stunk last year. Maybe he can help him turn around his fortunes at the quarterback position. Certainly a lot of draft capital invested there. They would love that in Carolina if he actually wasn't a terrible bust. The stack here is just a little ambiguous. Once you get past Johnson, who isn't a particularly amazing fall in love kind of stack option as it stands, like Thielen is old. So you don't know exactly how far off the cliff he's going to fall. And the other guys are just unproven. You can say what you want about Xavier Legette's athletic profile, which looks fantastic. Is he going to actually get it done? That remains to be seen. A lot of people are betting on that. I'm sort of holding neutral on this. I'm not yet getting too invested, but I do understand why you might do it. Tampa Bay is just bring back here for Carolina week 17, Arizona week 16. That's actually a pretty good pair late in the best ball season to have your opponent being for best ball game stacks. Do you like anybody paired up here with Carolina?
Yeah, I'm pretty high on Tampa Bay as a team still. I know obviously, you make the Dave Canales argument for Carolina. You should probably also, we could talk about that as potential factor working against them for in Tampa Bay there, but I'm still pretty high on them as an offense. I think that the new play call is going to do a good job as well. And we've talked quite a few times this offseason about the potential impact for Chris Godwin, more so working in the slot. So I think that that's probably the guy who stands out the most for me. I think Mike Evans is a great best ball option. He's going to have weeks where he sort of disappears at times, but we know that he's going to have the big spike weeks like we saw a couple times last year. So I think that's fine. Kate Otten also effectively free at the end of drafts. And then I think Rachaad White's a guy who, if you draft him in the middle to later parts of drafts as your potential RB1 when you're starting with a running back later, I think that's also fine as well.
Last stack on the upside here, we've got Russell Wilson and the Steelers. Freiermuth is the one who's moving up probably the hardest here at the tight end position. He's up to Wilson's basically going from not drafted in every draft to getting drafted in more drafts. I don't really think the 209 ADP matters there. You're basically taking him almost as late as you want him. George Pickens is who everyone loves.
Yeah.
He's up a couple of ticks, but mostly flat. Justin Fields is moving down. He stinks. Don't draft him. Roman Wilson is down spots, and then you see Calvin Austin sort of wriggling around at the bottom 215. I'm selling the Steelers stack. Let's get your opinion first. What are you doing here with the Steelers? I'm just not stacking them up.
Yeah, I think it all depends on if you draft George Pickens. I'm not going into drafts looking to stack the Steelers, but if I end up with Pickens, I don't mind rounding it out if that's an an easy stack option, or maybe I lose out on a potential stack option later in the draft. I think if you already have Pickens at that ADP, it makes sense to potentially stack Wilson with him, just because you are kind of paying a pretty hefty price tag there for Pickens. Like you mentioned, Freiermuth is fairly affordable, so I think you can easily round out a stack there. And then even adding Roman Wilson later on the draft as well. I think there's definitely a non-zero chance that Fields works his way into Wilson's fantasy upside in one way or another, whether that's rushing touchdowns and red zone packages, injury, or if Wilson just flat out loses the job. I will say we probably are looking at Fields seeing his ADP fall due to the fact that Madden put him as a kick returner in one of their trailers, which I thought was hilarious, and it seems like a real possibility there. But all in all, I think it comes down to George Pickens. If you have him, I don't mind rounding out a stack, but for the most part, it's between neutral and sell for me here.
You know my take on Fields. If you're around our Slack channels, you know that I have been selling him short for years, and that has panned out in the correct direction. Obviously, the Arthur Smith addition as offensive coordinator gives them a fresh dose of rush percent that they didn't already need to jam the run absolutely straight down our throats. So Russell Wilson being underwhelming, oscillating his decisions between missed deep throws and low value checkdowns. Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson they're like mildly interesting, but they don't exactly outshine similar options in their price range. I'm just not that interested in the Steelers right now. George Pickens, of course, is probably my second favorite. I think the most draftable player, just in terms of values, Freiermuth, if you need a tight end in the late rounds. Okay, honorable mentions going up in their ADPs. Julian McLaughlin is still rocketing up boards. Kimani Vidal up to 156. So McLaughlin 154 already, Kyle. He could actually be moving up even higher than that, the way people are talking about him. Clyde Edwards-Helaire finally getting recognized as a living, breathing human, up to 201. We mentioned Godwin. He's moving up a couple of ticks, up to 60. Rice up to 72. Joshua Palmer finally getting priced more appropriately, up to 107. Brandon Cooks, Ricky Pearsall, Greg Dortch rounding up wide receivers, moving up. At the tight end position, Kyle Pitts, Brock Bowers, sort of the higher end tight ends moving up their positional board. Noah Fant, likely Jonnu Smith and Jelani Woods at the back end of the draft, all clicking up just a hair as we examine the ADP markets. Now, moving down the board, we're going to start by talking about a couple of quarterbacks here. Higher price quarterbacks even. Joe Burrow. Kyle, I saw him get drafted this morning, like 100th overall. What's the deal? Why are people down on Joe Burrow?
I'm not really sure, but in my show sheet, I put buy in all capitals and 3 exclamation points. So I am totally fine with the price falling here for Joe Burrow. I think maybe it comes down to the fact that guys are just missing out on completing a full stack for this team potentially. But even if you miss out on T. Higgins and Jamar Chase, I think you can still build a fairly cheap stack. Like it's almost like a value stack at this point with how cheap Burrow is getting, especially if you are able to get him in the hundreds. I had a draft last night that he almost fell to me, around I think 98 or 99. So I think if that's going to be the case, I'm going to buy up there. I think they're going to be one of the more explosive pass offenses in my eyes, not only in efficiency but also volume wise. And now they're becoming, in my opinion, one of the more underrated stacks. Obviously, difficult to say Jamar Chase is underrated with how high he is up on the board, but we view T. Higgins as underrated. We both like Jermaine Burton. I like Mike Gesicki for whatever sick reason that is. But I think there's a lot to like here and a lot of ways to form a cheap stack here with the Cincinnati team. So I will definitely be buying up here.
Cincinnati, number 2, pass rate over expectation. Mentioned that earlier in the Titans blurb. Obviously with the rushing attack losing Joe Mixon, they're not going to be like better with Marlon or with Mac, right? Like they're just not going to be better coming up this year. So yeah, this is not a situation that I'm looking to attack. Burrow was not 100% last year. So I'm looking at the Bengals passing game as the thing to attack here with the Bengals, not their rushing attack. And you mentioned a lot of other good points with their pass catchers. Now, moving on to CJ Stroud, he is now down to roughly 64 in ADP. This is a situation where the pass catchers are all going very high, but the quarterback is slipping. Help me make sense of that, Kyle.
Yeah, I think this is a simple fact that it's just difficult to stack him in best ball, and this is purely a best ball take for me, and that's why it would be sort of a sell for me on CJ Stroud, just because it's very difficult to get to a well-formed stack here with a couple of pass catchers, just because they have three elite receivers, so it's difficult to see a guy later in drafts from a pass catching perspective that isn't a tight end or a running back that could potentially be involved here. And for that reason, it's just difficult to stack. So that's why it's just simply a best ball take for me, and why I'd be selling Stroud. He's in a kind of a range that I think I can get a couple of elite guys just slightly before that, and a couple of really high upside guys slightly after that. So it just comes down to the ability to stack Stroud. It's very difficult for me to pay that price for all these receivers here. I think there's a very real world where you can argue each and every one of these guys finishes as the wide receiver 1 on his team, and each and every one of them has the ability to finish as the wide receiver 3 on this team. You can add Dalton Schultz late in drafts if you wanted to complete the stack with CJ Stroud, and maybe you do get one of those wide receivers. So if maybe one of those receivers falls to you, definitely be ready to hop on that, because I think that it could be a strong buying option there. But for the most part, I still think the ADP is a little bit in a weird spot here for Stroud, just from a stacking and a best ball perspective.
Feels like that's what the market's experiencing here. I don't think anyone's actually that short on Stroud. I'm certainly not
Agreed.
short on Stroud as a player in real life, but it's in the draft that's difficult, like you said, to get there. I'm scared, quite frankly, because this offense looks pretty damn good. I know I'm not the biggest Stephon Diggs fan, but he definitely could add something to this offense. Dalton Schultz certainly can bring it from the tight end position. You've got 4 really dangerous options out there running routes every single time. And of course, Joe Mixon, while he is not the amazing player we once hoped he would be, he is certainly capable of improving this rush attack. I think the problem that I have in the late stages of best ball is that you're going to be up against Kansas City and Baltimore. Those could be 2 pretty good defenses. Not saying that, Stroud isn't the kind of player, at least in what he showed in year 1, that could get by any defense. It's just a situation where there definitely are going to be softer spots on paper than stacking Houston in those week 16 and 17 big money showdowns. Let's get into Caleb Williams, who is down to 109.5 in ADP as of just before the show, Kyle. I'm buying Caleb Williams, but let's hear your take on this. How do you feel about the Bears offense with all their new weaponry?
Yeah, it's going to be a buy for me as well. I think, in terms of looking at the pass catchers' values, I think the one guy is overpriced is Rome Odunze, and I think the other 2 guys are pretty strongly priced, if not just fairly priced. And I think the fact that the public is so high on Odunze kind of, flattens out Moore and Keenan Allen here. I also don't mind stacking him up with one of these late tight ends as well. I think you can even throw Joe Everett in the case. Cole Kmet, I think, is obviously clearly the top guy, but also pairing DeAndre Swift as a potential pass catching option. It's always interesting to see how a quarterback, who was able to just throw the ball down the field all the time in college, how he steps into the NFL, if he's able to, find his check down more, if he's willing to find the check down more. So that's kind of a question mark here, but I don't mind taking the chance there with Swift. But ideally, you get one of DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, or even Rome Odunze if he falls in drafts, and then round it out with, a late tight end or maybe even DeAndre Swift. But regardless, I still think we're going to see these rookie quarterbacks like Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels just be a little bit too underpriced just because of the question marks around them. And in my opinion, that's spots that we should be buying up in best ball, just because I think it works so well for that format.
Yeah, if you're looking at trying to buy a stock low, I think Williams, just because, again, rookie, the Bears historically have not been seen as a very high-powered offense. I know everyone's on this. Everyone's aware of what's going on here in Chicago, but I would still say that you're probably not going to get him much cheaper than he is now if he ends up being the quarterback that they drafted him to be. So it's worth taking a shot on, at least from an investing standpoint. If you're buying for upside, you're buying call options on Caleb Williams. Now, let's get into Keon Coleman. Keon's down to 76. I think there's a little bit of uncertainty here with the Buffalo pass catchers, but to be candid, Kyle, I don't really know who else is going to be like their red zone guy among those guys, right? I mean, is it going to be Curtis Samuel and Shakir don't really strike me as the type to make contested catches on fade routes. I think Keon Coleman is the best fit there. How do you feel about him dropping down to 76?
Yeah, I still think he's my second favorite pass catching option with Josh Allen. Obviously, Dalton Kincaid's going to be the guy for me, but I'm still buying Keon Coleman. I love this fit and I love the draft selection from him since they called his name on draft day. So I'm going to continue to kind of ride by that take from the first instinct there. I think it's a great fit for Coleman. I think it's a great addition for Josh Allen there. And again, I think that best ball rookie argument does hold some weight here, as we should expect Coleman to develop more, become more productive as the season goes on when it matters most. So if his ADP is going to fall, I will definitely buy here.
All right, last name on the downside that I want to talk about, Antonio Gibson. We mentioned earlier the Patriots. I saved this one for a little bit later. He's down to 164. We mentioned Ramondre Stevenson getting the big contract. All the other Patriots are going up. Why is he going down?
I think it might just be because people are able to buy in on Stevenson and Douglas. So I do think that people are in the boat of thinking that the Patriots offense probably won't be all that explosive. So you probably don't want to overexpose yourself to this offense too much, which I agree with. So I think for me, my take would be neutral on it. If I don't get Stevenson or Douglas, I'm fine with rounding out a team with Antonio Gibson, but I'm definitely not going to be going out of my way to get multiple Patriots, especially if I'm not adding Drake May later on in the draft. So I think that's probably why the public is seeing this sort of movement here, and that's my take as well.
Generally agree. I do want to go get some shares. I don't think I have any, or I don't have very many if I have any right now. Just thinking about the idea that Ramondre Stevenson and Gibson are all they have on that depth chart, right? Like Kevin Harris stinks. Like they have nothing else right now. And if anything happens to Stevenson, he gets dinged up a little bit and misses a game. I mean, you're going to have some value here with Gibson. You're paying almost nothing for him. And there's a couple of different draft strategies that you can take where you might need to get a running back down at 160. But if anything that doesn't involve taking nothing but wide receivers early, or pretty much, you're going to have to get at least one running back a little bit deeper down the draft. And Gibson is somebody that I think might fit that bill. Maybe not the very best one, but certainly somebody that I don't think I'm going to have zero of. Honorable mentions at falling down the board. Jacobs keeps falling down. Josh Jacobs, Green Bay Packers, down to 52. Kamara continues to slide a little bit down to 75. Rashad White, surprisingly down to 63, albeit he is in that area of the draft where running backs tend to not be as popular. Xavier Worthy's finally slipping down a little bit, but I wouldn't call it a major fall. He's down to 62. That's basically it. No one's losing value at the wide receiver position. Everyone's going up. Tight ends, not really a lot of downward momentum at tight end either. I think Benson not. It's the closest thing to worth mentioning, down to 171. Let's get into our weekly topic here, Kyle. We want to talk this week about the running back landscape. In tier number 1, I think that's a 3-player tier of McCaffrey, Robinson, Breece Hall. Tier number 2, you've got Gibbs, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley, and then you start to fall off a little bit, but not too much. 2 real high upside guys in tier 3, Ashane and Williams, and then of course Derrick Henry would round out that tier. I think he's also got some upside from the touchdown perspective, especially on underdog. Tier 4, Travis Etienne, Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, James Cook, Joe Mixon, Rashad White. Tier number 5, Ken Walker, Kamara, Montgomery Jones. Tier 6, we are going to get into now the Ramondre Stevenson kind of range where people are starting to take their zero RB teams more seriously. Najee Harris, Jonathan Brooks, Zamir White, DeAndre Swift, Jalen Warren. This list, actually, I'm not going to read all these names off. This gets all the way down to Tyjae Spears. That's probably the biggest tier to me is that tier. All right. So before we get off on the tangent of reading every single running back's name, Kyle, where do you find yourself right now starting your running back drafts? Looking at the marketplace, looking at the idea that at the very top of the draft, there are very short tiers and very big drop-offs, and really down the draft board more, there's bigger tiers with more evenly matched players. Where are you starting 2024?
Yeah, for the most part, I've been actually having some luck with getting some of these tier 2 options, Gibbs, Taylor, and Saquon Barkley, a little bit later in drafts compared to ADP. In the middle parts of rounds, I've had a couple of drafts in the 7 or 8 spot where I'm able to start with Bijan Robinson in a hero RB build, which I do like a lot. So, if I can get one of those, I guess 3 or 4 guys between Bijan and then one of these tier 2 options, I don't mind starting there. But for the most part, I have been holding off until later parts in the draft, middle parts of the draft, and the tier 4, tier 5 range even. to start drafting running backs. But I have had a lot of luck recently was getting some of these earlier running backs falling in ADP. So that's sort of where, at least in the last 4 or 5 drafts, I've been able to find guys.
Even if you're going with a running back early, are you following the lead of the market where basically the market is holding off a lot longer than they used to on the running back position? It's been devalued in real life, it's been devalued in fantasy football. Are you mostly doing the volatile strategies of waiting on running back zero RB, hero RB, or are you mixing in any builds that include two in the early rounds?
I definitely have had some that I've mixed in early running backs. Again, like there have been guys who have just fallen to me, so I'm just taking them as values. But I do think that for the most part, I have been leaning into that strategy as well. I think you can make a case to where you're talking about the public zigging. So you zag, we do that in DFS all the time, right? Just trying to be contrarian. So it could be a spot where you could do that, and that could be your case for just being different in best ball. But there have been guys like Shane has fallen a couple times to me, Barkley's fallen a couple times, so I'm able to start with 2 running backs fairly early. But for the most part, I am leaning into that strategy of waiting on running backs and loading up on receivers pretty early.
Is there a running back dead zone, and where does it start?
I would say yes, but I don't think it's as dramatic as in years past, or maybe even as dramatic as people want it to be. I do think that there's a couple of guys that you could argue are part of the dead zone in tier 3, but for the most part, I do think that it's the tier 4 and tier 5 guys that I would personally view as the dead zone.
Yeah, and you're talking about guys like ETN, Cook, Jacobs, maybe even Walker, Kamara, Montgomery, and Jones, right? Like that whole stretch in the center here is where, I mean, maybe they're not all going to end up being dead, but that's certainly the place where you'd find your traditional dead zones where they're the top running back on their team. The draft capital is a little bit higher, but they may fall short of expectations for one reason or another.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
If you do hold off on running back and fade the early round options altogether, name 3 backs you feel great about getting in the middle rounds to start your draft.
Yeah, I think on a little bit of the earlier ledge, I would say is Isaiah Pacheco. I like him a lot, and I do like getting him as my RB1 option. Obviously, it's a little bit earlier, but a little bit later. Ramondre is a guy that we've talked about a lot already in just the 2 shows that we've done, and he's a guy that I don't mind. And I've had a couple of drafts where I've started off with him as my first running back, and then Zamir White's another one as well.
Yeah, I would throw in Rashad White for me. I do think that, especially on DraftKings, the way that they're going to operate their offense, it could be beneficial in the passing game in terms of the number of targets he'll get this year for Rashad White. Getting into 3 targets after round 10 that you think fit the volatile RB drafting strategies. Who are your favorites in terms of the real zero RB candidates?
Yeah, I mean, Javonte Williams is slowly working his way into consideration there. Honestly, we keep getting negative reports from him, and I'm not necessarily buying them. So I'm fine with including him here. Spears is a guy that I like. Rico Dowdle is another guy that I like, and he also pairs well with quite a few teams later on in the season. Ty Chandler is another, and then Blake Corum.
I'm drafting a lot of zero RB teams, and Spears, Dowdle, and Chandler are like 3 of my highest owned guys across the board. So that's not surprising given how I've drafted my team so far. But I do think each one of those guys has merit for those strategies. Let's talk about, of the guys that you've mentioned, well, I should say, other than the guys that you've mentioned, name the top ambiguous backfields to target where you think that maybe the fact that there's not a clear back leading the charge is leading to some potential profits in terms of how things could shake out in the season.
Yeah, I think the top one for me right now is the Panthers. I do think that we're seeing Brooks kind of have a pretty high ADP still, but I've seen him fall in a lot of drafts recently. So I would not be surprised if by July, if we don't get a really strong report on him about his knee, that he continues to fall in drafts. And even if we do get a strong report on him, Chuba Hubbard could potentially become a value as well. He's going very late in draft. So Panthers are a team there. The Chargers as well. Again, similar sort of deal here with J.K. Dobbins. Again, we don't have a ton of information on the health of him, and obviously Kamani Vidal's ADP continues to rise. But if Dobbins is healthy, it sounds like he could be a pretty clear-cut starter in this offense. And obviously have Gus Edwards there as well. And then obviously the Steelers, I think if we knew one way or the other who was going to be the guy there, we probably won't even see a guy this year. But if we can find one being more productive, I do think that both of these guys are kind of eating at each other's ADP here.
Yeah, and I'll throw in Dallas because people are going to draft Zeke Elliott ahead of Dowdle. Not so sure that's how that's going to shake out at the end of the season. Okay, best spot for potential backups to usurp the starter totally out of the blue. Give me 3 guys who could actually end up being the starter by the end of the year that aren't seen that way now.
Yep, I'm going to go with Chase Brown taking Zach Moss's job, Zach Charbonnet to take Kenneth Walker's job. I think that one's probably a little bit harder of a path there, but again, Kenneth Walker's been dealing with injury pretty much his entire career. And then I guess I'll throw 2 more in just because I have one that I really like. The Rams is going to be a very popular one. Blake Corum taking Kyron Williams' job is something that I think a lot of people are talking about. And then lastly, Trey Benson stealing the job from James Conner.
All right, Kyle, that's going to do it for this episode. Before we jump out of here, of all the running backs on the board, give me the one that you think you're the most bullish on compared to the price tag that's available in drafts.
Yeah, I think for me, it's going to be Isaiah Pacheco. I just like him quite a bit here. And for me personally, I don't mind going into, I don't want to say all drafts because obviously last episode we talked about diversifying and whatnot, but I don't mind going into a large majority of drafts saying I'm going to start with either the run game for Kansas City or the passing game. I think obviously targeting the Kansas City offense is not a hot take. I think they're going to be very elite and explosive again. I think the offensive line is going to be a very good one to run behind for Pacheco, and I think his role is elite. So, yeah, I'll go with Isaiah Pacheco there.
Now, I need you to sell one running back short. What back are you now going to be the shortest on for the 2024 season?
This one's pretty easy for me. It's Kyron Williams. I've seen a lot of people talking about his price not being too bad, and I know he's falling in drafts, but him as a 3rd-round pick, I just can't necessarily get behind, and I think this could easily be one that haunts people just because of the fact that there's so many signals right now that should be pointing to us having massive doubts as to why he can repeat here, let alone potentially even hold on to the job. And I think the biggest thing that is kind of ignited that fire there is the draft capital that the Rams spent on Blake Corum.
He's Kyle Murray. I'm Chris Gimino. We're RotoGrinders. We'll be back next week for another episode of Stonk Watch.